Lucius Best, better known by his superhero alias Frozone, ice-skated his way into fans' hearts the day he made his appearance on the big screen, and his relationship with the entire Parr family is unmatched by anyone aside from maybe Edna.
I used to design for gods. But perhaps you'll come with a challenge, eh?
Lucius even has a good relationship with the young Incredibles, Dash, Violet, and Jack, where he's shown to be a sort of fun uncle to the children. But given the relationship that he had with the entire Parr family, it's hard not to wonder why he didn't expand his own family and have children. Sadly, though, after digging around and looking at some of the old footage from the original storyboard for the Incredibles, it looks like the answer might be more devastating than originally thought. Lucius Best was shown on multiple occasions to have a good relationship with kids and not seem to mind them, yet he and his wife Honey didn't have any of their own, leaving fans to wonder why that might be. His character was clearly shown as someone who appreciated the idea of family, so he stuck by his superhero partner Mr. Incredible and his family no matter what. And when Mr. Incredible, aka Bob Parr, had settled down and had children with his wife Helen, aka Elastigirl, Frozone stood by their side. Literally, in the first Incredibles movie, Pixar showed fans that Lucius was even Bob's best man during his wedding. On top of that, he still continued to spend time with the Parrs long after superheroes were outlawed, even when they decided to start their family. In fact, Lucius was shown in both the first and second Incredibles movies to be really good with the children, as he had a personal rapport with each one. They all even called him Uncle Lucius, except for Jack, of course, but every one of the Parrs that can speak clearly considered Frozone a member of their family. But as mentioned before, despite all of that, Lucius and his wife Honey never had any children, at least not in the franchise thus far, and the reason behind this is pretty upsetting. You see, there are actually 3 theories in mind as to why Frozone and his wife never chose to be like the Incredibles and have kids, the most interesting of which involves one of the original storyboards for the script and actually has a much deeper meaning to the world around the Incredibles and might prove that Lucius and Honey not having children wasn't really their choice. That being said, there are 2 more theories that don't really require much evidence, at least not from the storyline, but even though they're not as interesting, one of them is just as heartbreaking as the main theory. You see, according to that theory, the Incredibles took place in a world where, before being a superheroes band, it was illegal for superpowered people to have children, which led Frozone to spend his life wishing he could have a family that would never be possible. And before you brush this off as something that wouldn't even be possible, it's important to note that in the original storyboard, this was actually something that was discussed, which will actually come up in a second. First, it's important to think about why the government would outlaw or forbid superheroes from having children. The first piece of evidence that this would even be possible is the fact that throughout the majority of the first Incredibles movie, being a superhero in general was made illegal. Anyone with superpowers was forced to assume a normal identity, and though they didn't discuss what happened to those who didn't comply, there's a good chance they ended up imprisoned, or worse. The government in the Incredibles universe is clearly not afraid to show that they need to be in control.
Politicians don't understand people who do good simply because it's right. Makes them nervous.
So it's definitely fair to assume that they would want to control whether or not superpowered humans could have offspring. If anything, it's more likely that they would want to pick and choose who could have children so that they could determine the sort of powers that people were born with. And to think that there's a chance that Frozone and his wife might have wanted babies but simply weren't allowed to do so based on what the law said is truly sad to think about. But it's a law that his character would certainly follow. Pixar showed on multiple occasions that out of Mr. Incredible and Frozone, it was Frozone that was stricter about the rules. This was proven in the first movie when they showed Bob as being the more rebellious of the two when it came to the rules. Lucius, as much as he hated hanging up his supersuit and stopping being Frozone, he did it because that was the law and that's the type of character that he was. Whether it was right or wrong, unless people were in imminent danger, Lucius Best and Honey followed the law, meaning that if the government did ban all supers from having children, there's almost no doubt that Frozone would obey. And as mentioned before, this was a law that had actually been discussed and written into the original opening of The Incredibles. The story was ultimately rewritten, but the original animated storyboard has been posted to multiple sources online and shows that the world of The Incredibles originally started out as a completely different place. The animation shows a world where Mr. Incredible and his wife Elastigirl had had hung up their proverbial capes and started a family in secret. And during the animation, there was a point where their house got broken into by Syndrome, who was already an established villain. A fight between Syndrome and the Incredibles broke out before the sound of a baby crying stopped the villain in his tracks. It's then that he revealed that by having a child, Bob and Helen Parr had broken the law. He mockingly said, "You know supers aren't supposed to breed." And though that storyline obviously didn't make it into the final script, that doesn't mean that some of the rules didn't. It would have made a lot of sense for a government to want to control who had superpowers and what they did with them. So perhaps an unspoken rule that made it into the final cut was that the supers weren't allowed to have children. A rule that, if it existed, Bob would have no problem breaking, since he most likely wouldn't believe in the government imposing on personal freedoms that much. Frozone, on the other hand, was always shown in the movies to follow the rules unless it was a matter of life and death.
Honey?
What?
Where's my super suit?
What?
Where is my super suit?
Which means there's a chance that he would reluctantly comply with the law, even if he and Honey both wanted a family of their own. The next theory, centered around Frozone not having any children with his wife, is simple, and it's just that he and Honey didn't necessarily want children of their own. And though Lucius never mentioned this in either of the movies, it's just as possible as the idea of Frozone not being permitted by the government to have children, if not more so. There would be no reason why the same couldn't be said for Honey and Lucius, and would even explain why they never ended up having children of their own. On top of that, Frozone would have seen firsthand how hard it was to raise a child with superpowers. He got to watch his best friends do it not once, not twice, but 3 times. In The Incredibles, the Parrs were only really shown raising Jack Jack as a baby, but considering he was their 3rd child, they had to do that 2 times before that. And if the chaos that Jack Jack provided throughout both films was any indication of how tough it would be to raise a super baby, there's a good chance that a lot of people would opt out of it.
I'm processing. I'm doing the math. I'm fixing the boyfriend and keeping the baby from turning into a flaming monster. How do I do it?
And for anyone who might be curious as to why they wouldn't want to have kids, even though Lucius was clearly close with Violet, Dash, and Jack Jack, that answer is really simple too. Almost anyone can tell that just because you can tolerate children doesn't necessarily mean that you want them for yourself. That could have very well been Lucius's attitude, and though that's not as interesting as the government forbidding supers from having children, it's just as likely, if not more so.
Not like our other kids.
At last, there's another simple theory, but despite its simplicity, it's equally as heartbreaking as the government restricting Lucius and Honey from starting a family, and it considers the idea that they wanted children of their own, but simply were unable to do so. It's sad to consider the idea that Lucius and his wife wanted children but weren't able to have them, but in reality, that's entirely possible. Though it's never mentioned in either Incredibles movie, it's entirely possible that Lucius, Honey, or both were affected by infertility in some way. As possible as it is for Frozone and his wife to have fertility issues, this is hopefully the theory that fans are least likely to see if Pixar ever continues the Incredibles franchise. What do you think about these theories, though? Do any of them really explain why Frozone and his wife didn't have children? Make sure you let us know in the comments below.